Good morning, everyone. This is the Friday Bridges of Meaning Discord question and answer. Next week is Good Friday, and whether, I don't know if you'll say it's good or not, but I'm not going to do a question and answer live stream next week. Next week is I've got a few extra things. We have a Good Friday service at Living Stones. We have Easter Sunday. So next week, no Friday Q&A from me next week. So if you put a question in the short questions for PVK queue, it'll be there for when I get back to them, which will probably just be the week after. All right, let's thank you for everyone who's showing up in the little group. The group will grow as the stream goes on. It's always how it works. First question. Pray for my posture and calf. Can I ask a question about canticles? You certainly may. I just can't answer it because I don't know anything about it. So that one's short. And I'm breaking the tradition of spending a half hour on the first question. And we'll move on to the second question. Maybe I'll spend a half hour on that one. Paul, my believing friends are being completely consumed by conspiracy theories. That's interesting. I don't say this derogatorily, as I know that label is often used to silence dissent. That's not what I mean. I mean large sweeping narratives that are both overly simplistic and unnecessarily complex. Yeah. I had a conversation with Brett Sockold on conspiracy theories. Things like the Nephilim agenda. If you haven't watched it, Jonathan Peugeot's video on the Book of Enoch, I thought was outstanding and a really terrific primer into Jonathan and his brother's metaphysic, or at least narrative structure. Aliens genetically engineering humans to mine gold for them. Wow. Etc. You've got some creative friends. I wish I was joking, but I'm so heartbroken to see my friends get caught up in it. It honestly seems like a distraction from the gospel in Old Testament fan fiction form. They're living the Book of Enoch. Their best Book of Enoch life now. Do you have any thoughts or suggestions? For little alien heads. If these, in fact, well, there's a lot to say here. And so I'm just trying to figure out a hierarchy of value in my head with respect to all of the answers that rush in from my consciousness Congress. Once you believe that there are agencies levels above us, and that these agencies are impacting us, conspiracy theories, depending on exactly how you define the term, are not crazy. Now, that doesn't mean that many conspiracy theories aren't crazy, because we sort of look up at the clouds and see things and can tell stories about them. And one way to think about almost any significant religion is along the lines of a conspiracy theory. And I think part of the reason these are running wild right now is because of the breakdown of most of the narratives that held that position in our imagination. I just finished this morning the Jonathan Peugeot, Benjamin Boyce, James Lindsay conversation, which was fascinating. because, as those of you who follow me on Twitter know, I made a little video that basically said James Lindsay is a deist. And then I posted another video on my channel that basically said Sam Harris used, basically agreeing with Sam here in the Discord that Sam Harris is basically a Unitarian Universalist without an afterlife. That's pretty much what he is, as heard from his description of God and religion with Glenn Lowry. You can take almost any of these things and add a little bit of narrative spice to them and come up with something that looks sort of like a conspiracy theory. What is a conspiracy theory? A conspiracy theory, what was the name of the guy? He wrote a really nice book on Peter Thiel's conspiracy to dethrone Gawker. This is a guy, he has YouTubes about Stoicism. This is a really fun book. I really enjoyed that. There's a lot of books that I start that I enjoy, but I don't get all the way through. That book I went all the way through because it was just simply fascinating listening to how Peter Thiel concocted this conspiracy. And it was sort of a very human physical conspiracy to take down Gawker Media over the Hulk Hogan, using the Hulk Hogan deal. Fascinating story and well worth your time to read. It's not a very long read. Part of what is happening now in kind of late modernity, twilight of modernity, is that narratively shackles are breaking down. Bolts are rusting and giving way, and that is leading to, as Peugeot talks about, clown world. Peugeot released for Patreons a nice treatment of Will Smith and Chris Rock. That's the only Peugeot Patreon video I've ever watched. I've been a patron of him for a few years now, and because I want to support his work. And, that happened when, he got flooded out, because I want to do something to, tangibly support him. But I just never pay any attention to it. And hope he'll probably release it at some point. He touched on it with the James Lindsay conversation too, in terms of we're moving from clown world to control world. And that's sort of what Rod Dreher has been talking about in terms of going from Weimar to the Third Reich. And so Peugeot really sees that as the times that we're in. And I agree with that to a degree. These things move incredibly slowly, and I think there's a perennial nature to a lot of these things. Often these things are running in little cycles and manifesting in little ways. And when you get really big arcs, like communism for the 20th century or the Third Reich from 1933 to 1945, you get bigger blooms, but then they tend to go down. Straps are rusting and breaking, bolts are giving way, and people are filling up their imaginations with all kinds of crazy ideas. Most of these ideas are going to not last very long, because the majority of people, by virtue of the demands of their regular daily life, don't have time to really worry about the Nephilim aliens and our gold mining. Maybe the world is just Bitcoin miners for aliens. Maybe the aliens are just trying to have us burn our national resources to mine Bitcoin. That could be. I mean, you can concoct these things all day. And again, I regularly talk to homeless folks, and homeless folks often indulge in wild conspiracy theories, and will just rattle off 2 or 3 or 4 of them, most of which don't line up with each other, but they just sort of run through them quickly. So that's sort of normal human behavior. It really is. And it only gets it only gets controlled with things like having to put food on the table for your family, having very physical, tangible, historical responsibilities. And it also gets controlled by larger governing religions, which are sort of like conspiracy theories, where there's a God in heaven who has designs for us, or there are designers to the simulation that have their own ideas in mind about what they're trying to calculate through the great computing machine of planet Earth. So, yeah, I'm not surprised you're having religious friends, believing friends have all kinds of crazy conspiracy theories. That also shows in some ways the breakdown of Christianity in a lot of churches. Now, the good news is most of these conspiracy theories will be fairly short-lived fevers. So the Benjamin Boyce, Jonathan Peugeot, James Lindsay video, they get into digital identity, crypto, U.S. government crypto, blockchain, all of this stuff. It's some scary stuff. And there's some real potential for this stuff to really get tyrannical. Will it? I don't know. Like I said, most of these things kind of burn themselves out. Let's look at COVID restrictions. Now, Jonathan mentioned that he can't even leave Canada because he's not vaccinated. And he doesn't necessarily have a problem with the vaccine. It's the principle of the matter. And so he's basically resisting overreaching Canadian tyranny by refusing to be vaccinated. In other words, he and James Lindsay's vaccinating status is sort of a quiet civil disobedience. I think that we'll probably see, this vaccination stuff probably go away. Does that mean that they're not setting up other means of control? No, they're right in the fear that these mechanisms of control, once created, the government tends to like to use them. And part of the ongoing, this is where good guys and bad guys get weird. Part of the ongoing conversation, especially in America, that has a long history of government suspicion, is that there are certain watchdog groups that bark when they worry about various means of control and identification. For example, if you get into the government ID debate, now, in the United States, we have driver's licenses, which are issued by the state, not by the federal government. Then you can get a state ID from the DMV, Department of Motor Vehicles, if you don't have a driver's license. But unlike many countries in the world, we don't have a national identity card that demonstrates citizenship. Now, there's Clear ID, which is sort of a federalizing of state standards. But so you get all these lines. Why don't we have a government ID that shows citizenship and, let's say, voting status? Like many countries in the world, when I lived in the Dominican Republic, I had a cédula. And a cédula was basically a government ID. It showed that I was a legal alien in the Dominican Republic. I did not have the right to vote, but I was in the country legally. So I had a government ID in the Dominican Republic. We don't have that in the United States. Why not? Because people get very nervous about it. So then, this gets into all sorts of interesting debates, such as voting access. Should you have to show a an ID when you vote. Now, this is where lines get really funny, because right now the Democratic Party is like, no, you shouldn't have to show any kind of identification to vote. It's kind of like, really? But if you were to suddenly decide, well, there's going to be a federal government ID in the United States, and you need to carry that ID with you, either in digital form or in a little plastic laminated card, the way most of our IDs are, like our state driver's license, then I would imagine a good bit of the Republican Party would be up in arms and say, hey, no way. So which way? So all of these things are always swirling around, partly because narrative is the best way for us to manage the world that's too big for us. Narrative is our natural compression scheme. Narrative is built in way, way down deep into our identity. What a human being is, in many respects, to themselves, their identity, their self, their psyche, their soul, is this ongoing, continually updated autobiography that you're storing in your head, which you imagine is you. So in that sense, Sam Harris, when he says there's no such thing as a self, it's like, it's, he's got a kind of a point in there, but yourself is a narrative. And, when John Vervaeke makes the point that you weren't really able to do this until you were like 3 or 4. I mean, think back to your earliest memories. Probably your earliest memories that you can think back to are actually tied to your capacity to begin understanding yourself as an autobiography. Okay. So right away, the basic framework for a conspiracy theory is built into your identity at a very low level. You are a narrative. So once you have a narrative, then, if you listen to how many people talking in sort of IDW space, they don't want us. They want to control the world. I mean, it could be Klaus Schwab. It could be any, the World Economic Forum is now sort of the new, what are they? The Illuminati. Well, and when you start to break down you begin to realize that, well, they're a committee, and anybody who knows and has been a part of a committee knows that a committee is sort of a they, but it's often a very complex they. And then when we get into talk about egregores and one level up and all of this stuff, now we begin to realize that there are agencies and formations. And again, if you listen to Peugeot, especially, I'm only about a half hour, 45 minutes into his Brett Weinstein talk. That's an interesting talk. That's a super interesting talk, because Peugeot is pushing, and then Peugeot even defines it as faith, which is a fascinating transformation. I'm really going to have to think long and hard about that. But this leveling up, so the individual is a consciousness congress that sort of coalesces around a fairly loose narrative that has agency and sort of wheedles its way through life. So that's an individual or a person. Then you have a family. I really love that infinity point that Mike Nana, James Lindsay talked about. He referenced it, and it's in the little video that I posted on Twitter, and I'll probably post it on my Vanderclips channel. So Peugeot sees these little leveling ups of agency. So just as a person has agency, a family has agency, and a city has agency, and a government has agency, and a committee has agency, and so even there, in strictly human terms that we're fairly comfortable with in a modernist frame, you've got all of these little agents that have will and intentionality, even if one single human being doesn't house all of that, but rather participates in that. You've got the makings of understanding everything to be a conspiracy theory. Now, some of these conspiracy theories are absolutely wild and untrue. And most of these conspiracy theories that are wild and untrue don't last long. I would argue that some of these conspiracy theories that are wild and untrue are actually spiritual entities that keep revisiting this is the best way to think about it, keep revisiting these contextualized reenactments of these conspiracy theories in local levels. And so if you just read a lot of stuff in the 18th, 19th, 16th century, you'll find all kinds of interesting conspiracy theories. And, they might be around alchemy or astrology and then you'll find patterns of these. And so in that way, maybe you can sort of discern some of these higher level patterns that keep coming down. And we talk about them in different ways. Jordan Peterson talks about them sort of like archetypes. You can think about them as spirits. You can think about them in a lot of different ways, but they're fairly perennial and they're fairly durable. So in the Matrix movie, the Wachowskis sort of conceptualize these as programs, and they get distilled into like the Merovingian. There's and his little vampires and things. So you basically have all of these things. I would say if the correlation is with a lot of your believing friends, part of it is because they're already naturally disposed to, at least on certain levels, to think about agencies leveled up. Whereas there's a certain amount of discipline in hardcore atheists that when their minds go there, other parts of the consciousness Congress slap them down and say, nope, no agents above human beings. That's our rule. But, you can see in Sam Harris's religion and James Lindsay's religion that rule is breaking up. It's almost like I used to watch all these Alaskan wilderness shows, and it's like when the river starts to thaw, and winter starts to give way, and so then you wind up with icebergs. And so the fact that you've got believing friends that are kind of going off the reservation, it also shows that there's a lot that's sort of breaking up in religion, because religion that was sort of resisting the long cold freeze of modernist winter is also becoming a little looser now. And so in Ross Douthat's book on decadence, towards the end of the book, he talks about how not only is our decadent age decadent in terms of our imagination in many common disciplines, let's say, that you can find in the university, we haven't had a lot of really creative religious fanatics either. You can find a lot of those in earlier centuries doing crazy, creative, often destructive things. And those modernity and the Enlightenment sort of kept a real lid on it. And I suspect that as the winter of modernity continues to give way, we're going to see a lot of crazy stuff. Look at the history of the burned over district after the Second Great Awakening in upstate New York. You had the flourishing of a number of religious groups that have really flourished over the last 100 years. You've got the Jehovah's Witnesses, you've got the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, you've got the Seventh-day Adventists, you've got all sorts of millennialism really gripped America. A lot of stuff happened, and we haven't seen that kind of religious energy unleashed for a while. Expect to see more of it. So, especially if you're still sort of, either if you're sort of in the thaw of the winter of modernity breaking up, or if you've already sort of jumped already over into a pretty substantial island and of religious development. I think that's a big part of why, there's a lot of interest back towards Orthodoxy or Catholicism. Those are very durable groups that have thought about a lot of things for a very long time in ways that often sort of outshine Protestants to the degree that Protestants have lost their roots. And so, again, another one of the Peugeot videos that came out with Jordan B. Cooper, the fact that Jordan B. Cooper is now sort of doing in Lutheran space what I've seen others doing in Calvinist space for a while, like Hans Boersma, Richard Mueller, Jordan B. Cooper mentioned. I'm going to have to look up Mueller. I left Calvin Seminary before he and the PhD program really got going. It would have been a lot of fun to have been there when, why can't I remember his name off the top of my head? Nathan was there getting his PhD and then going to Orthodoxy. So that's the way things are going. Now, a lot of people are making the jump into the arms of the Orthodox or the Roman Catholic or some magisterial Reformed or Protestant traditions that still have active memory back through the Reformation into church fathers. And, part of what I would imagine, I haven't had much of a chance yet to look into Jordan B. Cooper's work, but part of what I imagine he's trying to do is stake down some Lutheranism into the longer traditions of the Western church so that it can survive the breakup and the thaw of the modernity winter. So yeah, I'm not surprised you're seeing this. And I think what's going to happen is that, once you go and tell your friends that it's the space aliens or it's it's all kinds of rather crazy short-lived conspiracy theories and you get embarrassed by this. Now, some people just they don't get embarrassed by that. They just go from one to the next and they just love the ride. But a lot of people will get embarrassed by the fact that they really bit hard on a rather crazy conspiracy theory and they ran all around telling their friends. And then within a matter of weeks or months, it became patently obvious that they don't believe in it anymore. And now they have to, then they bump into their friends. Oh yeah. Didn't you believe in the Nephilim agenda of aliens making humans do Bitcoin on planet Earth for the collective of Thanos and his infinity? They do that a couple times and they'll have flights of fancy, but they'll shut up and they'll probably settle down in a longer, older, much more socially acceptable conspiracy theory, which again, to think that God has designs on your life isn't that far from a conspiracy theory. So it's a great question. I don't know. Anybody in the chat room want to say something about this?
There's a lot to say.
Yeah, too bad Grim Grizz isn't here.
Yeah.
I think he'd be a little disappointed because Grim is a connoisseur of the conspiracy theory.
We were actually talking about conspiracies, a few nights ago. It might not be a conspiracy in the way we think it is. It's just like all these dark people just kind of have similar ideas. And just like a lot of people in the light, we have similar ideas and we try to rally around each other and help. But, the dark people are also doing that as well. It might seem like a conspiracy, but they're just helping out each other whenever they see someone doing dark things. We just need to start doing the same on the light side, and it'll seem like we have a conspiracy, but it's really not like that. We're just I don't know. We have similar ideas. We want to help people. We don't want to, you know, enslave everybody in some commie globalist utopia or whatever, quote unquote utopia.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Hey, Paul, when you were in the Dominican Republic, you said you were a legal alien.
Yes, I was an alien.
Were you mining for gold down there?
No, I was enslaving the locals to mine for gold for me, and then I would take all that gold and bring it back to my home planet. You know, if aliens wanted to mine for gold and they can travel through space, from what I hear, they'd be better off working the asteroid belt. You know, Earth is all clogged up with us. So,
well, you know, they say the real reason is they come here to harvest our biological material. All right, I'm done.
That's what I'm here for. I harvest biological material every night. I call it dinner.
So, Paul, how uncomfortable is that skin suit on your scales, and how easy is it to take it off at night?
I just let me taste the air a little bit here. All right, next question. Were the Nephilim the ancestral memories of the Neanderthal or Denisovans? See, this is exactly what I'm talking about. We're at a place where long-standing answers are giving way, and so we're looking for new ones. I really liked Peugeot's video on Enoch and his treatment of the Nephilim, basically as, you know, when you take that old, let's see, who said it? We stand on the shoulders of giants. Why do we use that word giants in that phrase? And also in the Old Testament, where there are giants in the land of Canaan, and the giants settled with the daughters of men. So that actually, you know, Peugeot's take on that, I thought, was the most coherent take on that I had ever heard when I began to understand what he was talking about. Now, so a lot of Peugeot fans will be like, yay! Now, at the same time, one of the things that, so I listened to the Peugeot conversation with Jordan B. Cooper and the Peugeot video on Enoch right before was released, the Peugeot, these last two Peugeot videos, which are also really good and really important. Peugeot hasn't passed through the modern world untouched. By connecting the Nephilim with, let's say, Sargon of Akkad. Sargon of Akkad would be a Nephilim. Hercules would be a Nephilim. Alexander the Great could be a Nephilim. These are sons of God, sons of the gods. They're demigods. You know, Brad Pitt and Achilles in Troy is a Nephilim. Now, once you sort of define it that way, there's the materialist, the materialist section of my consciousness Congress sort of relaxes a little bit. Now, some other members of my consciousness Congress are watching the materialist members of my consciousness Congress relax, and that makes them anxious. So, yeah, I tend to think in terms right now, subject to change because everything's unstable here in the thaw of, at the end of modernity, the thaw of the winter of modernity. I tend to think that Peugeot's take on Nephilim is really brilliant and really coherent and really tracks well with, the total narrative package that he's bringing out. I have to do a lot more thinking about Peugeot and his brother's take on all of this, because there are aspects to it that make parts of my consciousness Congress uncomfortable. So, but yeah, it's really interesting stuff. All right, Joey asked a question, and it's fairly short. Good for you, Joey, since Joey's the keeper of the short questions. Hi, Paul. Not sure if you remember me, but we've spoken a few times. You freaking troll. When looking back at history, how do you evaluate the balance of influences for great social and technological change? Do you think they are being led by large cooperatives, formal or informal, with common spirit? Or is the spirit of a society more stagnant, being thrust forward by great individuals with singular vision and disruptive purpose? Well, I think both and that's because so Oscar, I feel bad, I think I think I was a little antagonistic and dismissive towards Oscar, because he's asking these questions that Oscar is asking about levels of being are really important, and a lot of that is deeply implicit in Peugeot's ontology. And I've got to do a lot more thinking about that, because it's a super complex and important question. Now, and I think Joey's question here is exactly
This question was definitely inspired by Oscar, but also I'm going to add that Oscar could not play nicely with others, so he's no longer on the Discord. So
unruly Bridgers.
We'll give him credit. He was asking questions about interesting things, and I do think that he should continue interacting in the YouTube comment section. But yeah, no more on the Discord. So
yeah, he had a little edge to him, but all right. There's so many different phrases of this question. It's sort of the great man theory of history versus and modernity had very impoverished language to talk about it. The movement theory of history. I mean, that's often how historians phrase it. And you can look in The Rest is History. They'd had a podcast on greatness where they sort of wrestle with this, and they revisit it often. We human beings are spiritual. And even though God is not a respecter of persons, which means that there's a certain equality with which God deals with us, it's sort of like equality under the law. It is also the case that we are not all equal in terms of spiritual power, by no means. And you know that basically by virtue of the fact that certain people throughout history have moved the world spiritually in ways that are far above average. And they can be good ways and bad ways. And they're not all religious figures. Some of them, especially in the last few hundred years, have been scientists. Galileo, Newton, Darwin. These have been powerful spiritual men. But here's the question. Is the locus of their spiritual power in them, or are other spiritual agents moving through them? Because you look at some of these guys and, you read a biography of Darwin, or you learn a little bit about his life. It was a rather sad life in many ways. Not quite the picture of, a spiritual giant, but in all fairness, as a Christian, Jesus is quite obscure until he starts his public ministry, which only lasts 3 years, and then he's killed by the Romans. And then his disciples claim that he is risen from the dead and he ascends into heaven. There are few people who have demonstrated more spiritual power in all of human history as Jesus of Nazareth. So there's that. Muhammad, the Buddha, Confucius, John Stuart Mill. So this is one of these questions that it just doesn't appear like we really have the perspective to get a definitive answer. And even when you say a common spirit, well, that's what a movement is. And if you look at, let's say, I made an argument in the video on the exorcism of John McWhorter that Bart Ehrman is right that what moves the needle in terms of religion in the world are miracles. And the American Civil Rights Movement was miraculous. Now, people will say, no, that's not my definition of a miracle. It's like leg lengthening or blind seeing or stuff that happens at a camp meeting or a Benny Hinn event. No, the American Civil Rights Movement was in some ways miraculous because there was this huge leap forward, this huge speeding up of the treatment and status and identity of African Americans in an incredibly short time period. Jim Crow legislation held sway over the South for a very long time, and a certain kind of racism in the North held sway for a very long time. And in the matter of a decade and some, most of that was swept away, and the lives of African Americans became significantly better in a very short order. America saw that miracle, and then all of a sudden everybody else wanted to apply the religious methods to pursue and produce a miracle on their own terms. And so you had the women's liberation movement that, again, was a long-standing movement that, sort of flourished then in the 70s. And of course, later you had the gay rights movement, which pretty much just took the page completely from the civil rights movement. Now, I tend to think that the transgender moment is going to be the undoing of the gay rights movement, and certain individuals like Andrew Sullivan have been yelling about that for quite a while now. So there's a lot going on. And the second part of your question about technology is part of it too. The civil rights movement was partly facilitated by television, probably in the same way or a similar way to how the Protestant Reformation was facilitated by the printing press. So suddenly, northern, white, mainline Christians and other Anabaptists and evangelicals and fundamentalists saw Bull Connor release police dogs and fire hoses on disciplined marchers. Disciplined because Martin Luther King Jr. took a page from Gandhi, who, had all of his ideas about soul force, and took a page from, Gandhi was reading Jesus. He didn't like Christianity, but he was quite interested in Jesus. So Martin Luther King Jr. took a page from that, disciplined his marchers to not hit back, to not strike back, to not have mostly peaceful protests, but to have 100% peaceful protests. And if there's violence, the only violence would come from the state. All of that was on TV, and Northerners saw and were like, this isn't my country. And there's a sharp contrast with something deep in American psyche. And this is where this early conversation between Jonathan Peugeot and James Linsky gets really complicated about rebellion, because Americans are like, our country is about the state not oppressing its own people. And Martin Luther King Jr.'s point at his most important speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial was, he pulled Thomas Jefferson and said, this is a promissory note that has now come due, and America must stop treating its African-American citizens like second-class citizens. And whoosh, the country was changed, and the country saw a miracle, and the country saw all the things that was connected to the miracle, but television was a part of that. And so then, now we know the magical religious liturgy to invoke the miracle. It has statues, and again, for a long time it's not there anymore. There was the big people statue on I-80 outside of Berkeley, right on the highway, and they just had these massive people. Again, for the Greeks they would have been gods, but they're holding signs, but there's nothing in the placard, which basically says put your own thing in there. But of course, when, let's say, anti-abortion people do it, that's violating the religion. Well, what religion is that? Well, suddenly then, you've got a religious conversation going on. So no, you're exactly right. Now, did Martin Luther King Jr. cause this? Yeah. But, a detailed look at the civil rights movement, he certainly wasn't alone, and he wasn't a perfect individual. Better to, it wasn't so good on his wife, what he did when he was on the road. So, and so then in that miracle that continues in many ways to grip the spiritual imagination of our country, all the way up to and including the protests after George Floyd, when the religious symbolism and rituals were so completely obvious. Did Martin Luther King Jr. do that? Well, there were lots of protests, 19th century mass movements, early 20th century, the suffrage movement, the temperance movement. That has become in America a deep part of our religion. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in many ways was able to take that, add some Gandhi and contextualize it within the African-American ecclesiastical theological tradition. Martin Luther King Jr. was, reading a fair number of neo-Orthodox, but also some liberals. I remember, so my history seminar at my senior year at Calvin, I studied Martin Luther King Jr. and his faith. And even though I sort of grew up assuming he was an evangelical, no, it was a lot more complex than that. There were some neo-Orthodox strains. There were some liberal theological strains. There was a lot going on in there. And as a college senior, I probably hadn't had read enough or knew enough theology and history to sort of be aware of that landscape. But your question, Joey, did Martin Luther King Jr. generate that spirit all by himself? No. Daddy King and Martin's upbringing in Atlanta, even during Jim Crow, Atlanta was one place where African Americans in the South could have a degree of affluence and autonomy and status. And if someone in Jim Crow Atlanta had status and wealth and position, it was Daddy King. And so young Martin grew up to one degree or another with a fair amount of privilege within that context and opportunity, and he used that opportunity, and that opportunity was given to him as he developed throughout his life, and he in many ways was well prepared. In other words, there was a lot of spirit that was all around him, that had been around, and of course he borrowed from Gandhi and the revolt against the British Empire, and Tolstoy is a big piece of that too, because Tolstoy was important for Gandhi. So he takes all of that spirit and it all comes through him. And of course, now we have to be careful here, because if you follow this thread too hard, you can have a meaning crisis, because then suddenly there's no remainder, there's no agency. Now, part of why we don't believe that is it was young Martin who took all of those spirits and the college he went to and the education he had, and then going to Birmingham, where he was in exactly the right place at the right time and had the right temperament. If you look at the beginning of the Birmingham bus protests, all of the other high status black preachers in the city didn't want to touch it because they would lose status. And young Martin was fresh out of seminary, and, well, let's put it on him. Well, they did put it on him, but the man and the moment found each other, and letter from a Birmingham jail, his, the way he could preach, everything came together, and whoosh, a miracle happened, and America is still in the spiritual power of that miracle. We do not sit in a perspective where we can sort of take it all apart. Now, why do we want to do that? Well, we want to do that for relevance realization. We want to find exactly the one thing, the philosopher's stone, if you will, to turn lead into gold. I don't think we're given that thing as human beings, partly because we're already in the system. And general intelligence seems to be connected with being able to do relevance realization a little bit better. But it's not just general intelligence, it's who you are and who raised you and where you are right now in terms of everything that's going to happen around you. And it often sort of looks random and unexpected. Nobody expected this great leader to come out of Birmingham, Alabama. But he didn't come out of Birmingham, Alabama. He came out of Atlanta. And a long history that had developed in Atlanta, the resources that could then be put into this unique individual, and the rest was history. And of course, ended with an assassin's bullet, which also plays into the narrative. There's a lot of speculation. If Martin Luther King Jr. had not been assassinated and had continued calling out against Vietnam, what would that have done to the civil rights movement? And don't forget that Martin Luther King Jr. would not have been who he was and got so much government attention if there had not been a fair amount of concern about other leaders such as Malcolm X or later Black Panthers. And so part of why I think American presidents sort of embraced Martin Luther King Jr. was he seemed a safer alternative than Malcolm X. He was Christian. And politically, it made a world of sense. So it's all of the things that you mentioned here, Joey. But figuring it out's really hard. All right, Noah M. Hi, Paul. I've been stewing over the ideas you brought into the Elden Ring video, and I was wondering, do you see any connection between Jacob wrestling with God and the desire for self-efficacy? Yeah, very much. I think video games can be, in some ways, analogous to exactly that. And Jacob wrestling with God is this really interesting story in terms of, again, when it's if the sacrifice of Isaac is the culmination of Abraham's story, it's not the end. It's the culmination of the story. Jacob wrestling with God is in many ways it's the peak, it's the high point of the Jacob story. He gets renamed. And it's interesting too, because Jacob is very agentic up to that point. And in terms of the narrative cycle, he seems to lose agency after that point. When we find Jacob as an old man, and so once the Joseph cycle begins, we have Joseph, it's because it's really not Joseph, it's really Joseph and Judah. Joseph gets all the attention, and rightfully so. He's sort of the main character of that story. But in terms of the longer story of Israel, Judah is the main character, because Joseph is basically used for the transformation of Judah. Tamar is also used for the transformation of Judah. But all these stories are nested in themselves, and Joseph is still nested sort of in with Jacob, because the culmination of the Joseph story happens with the death of Jacob. I mean, that's why, you can find storytelling. I don't know if there's any better storytelling in all of world literature than what you find in the Bible. And some of the best is in Genesis. It's an absolutely amazing book. The more you sit down and think at all the levels of these stories, it's just so unbelievably complex with so few words. It's just astounding. So, and this, but part of the complexity gets into your question. So in our humanist age, we tend to think of our fulfillment of our telos as the maximization of my self-efficacy. That's not what you get when Jacob wrestles with God. And I think this gets into my answer to Joey's question. Was Dr. Martin Luther King most self-efficacious, or was he finally the tool of God's miracle to liberate African Americans in the South from Jim Crow and in the North from less structured racism. And the Bible holds this tension like no other book I know. And that sort of rises to, the conclusion of the Joseph story, at least narratively in one respect, with Joseph telling his brothers, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. And what that means is that the Bible has an incredibly sophisticated, nuanced conception of agency, that human beings have amazing, potent agency, but it's always in communion and participation with spiritual agency. So Martin Luther King Jr. was the culmination of so much spiritual activity surrounding the enslavement of African Americans in the United States. That's why Frank Herbert and his Dune stuff is so interesting, because I remember reading that. Was Martin Luther King Jr. Dune Messiah? Was he the process of the breeding program and of the education program? What was it? Quetzalcoatl Haderach? Was that it? Because he's Daddy King's boy, and he's got the best opportunities that a Southern preacher's son could have. Now, it's important that he's from the South and not from New York or Chicago or Boston or LA, because those strains are different. Someone from those places couldn't liberate Southern African Americans from the bondage of Jim Crow. So the complexity of the biblical story is that Jacob is not diminished, but rather enhanced by God's agency working through him. And this is where, every now and then, fairly regularly, someone will want to try to corner me on Calvinist, divine election, predestination, all of these things. Because, and I had this conversation with Brett Sockold, because we tend to like to think of, especially if all the focus is on God number two, it's me or that other agent. But agency is far more complex than that, especially when you have an imaginary that posits us participating in a spiritual realm, and us in many ways being, and again, Mathieu Pajot's book shows, Adam is right there in the middle. And so we in some ways are, okay, so a video happens on the internet, and stores in Sacramento have their windows broken and are demolished. The video on the internet didn't do that. Something came through that video into people to act in the street in a particular way. We are the intersection. We are the conduit of spirits in the material world. That's the world we live in. And our agency, well, is it the agency of the video that got played out in mostly peaceful protests surrounding George Floyd? Sort of. Was it the spirit and the narrative of many people's lives that had things happen to them that culminated in those mostly peaceful protests? Sort of. So, yeah. And what's amazing in video games is that it seems to be some of what we're seeing is, it shouldn't come as a surprise, participatory narrative, which is what video games are. Look at their structures. And again, I don't, Peugeot and I are on the same page. I don't have hundreds of hours to devote to Elden Ring. It's at this stage in my life, it's not a good use of my time. Now, if I'd started playing when I was a kid, I would know a lot more, but these things came after me. It shouldn't surprise us that narrative participation in narrative through these machines that give an intense amount of feedback can develop in our psychology self-efficacy that can be deployed out into the world. That shouldn't surprise us at all. In fact, all of the moral panic around Call of Duty and other violent video games and video games rating system, that was all based on the same thing. We've been a little bit more concerned lately about the addictive quality of these games. But I think what we're seeing is that human beings, and this should be evident, human beings are more difficult to enslave than one might imagine. That doesn't mean that many human beings aren't simply enslaved. It does mean that human beings are seldom perfectly enslaved. And that's true in the 18th and 19th century in antebellum, in the antebellum American South, and it's true of video games today. And it's true in the Matrix. Certain numbers of people get sick of being batteries and find their way out. It's true in every prison. It's true in Alcatraz. Human beings make terrible slaves. We've got something in us. And the evidence of that something in us leads us to believe that we are in fact not simply products of the spirits in our society, but we are also spiritual actors. And when we realize that, that should hold the meaning crisis at bay. I can see there are real similarities in how we are changed when we encounter an uncompromising God. But I can see some real differences, like how no matter how hard a video game is, it will never prevent you from playing it again. Yeah. I think you're right. I think you're right. And, we've been playing games for a long time. We've had board games, had card games, we have dice games. And I would bet, now I hadn't played Elden Ring. I've not played Skyrim. I've not played World of Warcraft. The only, I know, Rick, I just offended Rick. Rick's going to go out the door and I've never come back. He knows I don't play. If I played World of Warcraft, I would beg Rick to be in his guild and he would hate me for it because he's like, we got to schlep this Vanderclay around all the time. And he's really a liability to our clan. But Rick would be like, oh, come on, let Paul play with us. He's not a bad guy. I'd be the little kid that always gets picked last on the playground. That's who I would be in World of Warcraft. It's just true. Notice how these things scale. The only computer game I play with any regularity is Civilization. And I play it against the AI built into the machine, and the AI is dumb. Sorry, Civ creators. The AI is dumb. And when you up the levels all the way to the top, which is the most fun way to play, you very quickly see that the only way the computer can beat me is if it, as my son Jared always says, cheats. What do you mean? It means if I start out with these resources, the computer gets all those resources. Usually, if I'm skilled enough, I can claw my way out of the initial hole that the handicap that the computer puts me in. And once I get ahead of it, I can beat it. Now, if I play Civ with Joey or Jared or others, that's a lot more fun because Joey and Jared are a lot smarter than that AI. They've also got biases that the AI doesn't have. And so, whenever I play with Jared, Jared usually winds up being something like a land empire, like Germany. And so never get into a land war with Jared. But I'm usually on some islands or continents and I have a Navy and an Air Force and he can't get to me because I keep sinking his land units in the middle of the sea. And, so that's how it often goes between me and Jared. So depending on where the AI places us, on the same continent. It's like, oh crap. Jared's going to build up a few elite units and then he's going to come in and he's going to start eating my empire. But if I'm on a different continent, I'm going to build my infrastructure and I'm going to build my navy and he's never going to get to me. And then we just have to deal with nukes at the end of the game. So is this unrelated to life? No. Is Jared a lot like me? Sure. Look at pictures of me when I was Jared's age. Looks a lot like me. It's self-efficacy. Part of the reason we don't wind up with all these definitive, clear answers to these things are that they go down very, very deep and they're really intertwined. So, yeah. Jacob wrestling with God. Yeah. But again, even just look at that story. Now ask yourself, who wins, God or Jacob? Now you might say, well, Jacob wins because it kind of says he wins, but then God cripples him. The answer is that the world wins and that they both win. Now, a lot of the simplistic games we play in which everyone's a winner and you hand out participation trophies, we find uninteresting. But again, part of the mastery and the amazing quality of narrative in the Bible is how can there finally be blessedness and victory and have it also be compelling and meaningful? Look at Jacob wrestling with God. It's all right there. So, great question. Oh boy. Spend all my time on Rick. I spent an hour and 15 minutes on a few questions. It's all your fault. So I don't play enough World of Warcraft. Given it is coming up to Easter, I would like to ask a question that's a little more technical in nature. Mark 15:34 and Matthew 27:46 both contain a reference to Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? John 19:30 quotes Jesus as saying, it is completed, tetelestai. Is the quote in John ever talked about as Jesus referring to the end of Psalm 22? They will come and tell about his saving deeds, and they will tell a future generation what he has accomplished. Good one. Boy, that might get put into a sermon at some point. I would dare bet that plenty of preachers have made that connection. I've never seen it done, but I think it's good. I'd use it. So now, if you want to dig down into history and rules of interpretation, I think the way the New Testament likes to read the Old, I think they'd love it. So I think it's a great observation. Yosef, Joe Smos, 788. It's been on the channel. Great guy. So I heard an interesting point in an interdenominational rabbinic panel this week. An audience member asked whether spirituality was percolating up and offered new opportunities both within denominations or ecumenically. One panelist stated that today's spirituality is very individualistic, and while that makes it appealing to Westerners, moderns today, it can only bring people together for one-off events, basically. That such spirituality is not enough to bind a community, much less sustain it long term. From where you're sitting, this little corner, your church, Reformed, Protestant, Christian, do you agree? I originally wrote this before listening to the Lowry Harris live stream. Harris seems to be caught in a contradiction. He opposes particularist provincial religion because that sort of God miracles can't exist. The science doesn't support it. And yet, individualist phenomenal experience is all that matters. I agree completely. I would agree with the tensions that the panelist raised. When you look at, I mean, look at the most meaningful communities that people form. They're almost always formed in suffering. And of all people of the world, the Jews should know this. When we have resources, especially with a culture of individualism, but even before so, I mean, people have been greedy, hoarding misers forever. Hence Jesus' parable about the barn builder. Guy experiences a windfall, and the point of the parable is that instead of with his windfall being generous to the poor and generous to the community, which is exactly what an Old Testament tzaddik would do, he builds barns and says, I'm going to use all of this wealth so that I'll have a great life from here on in. I'll be secure, and I'll be secure by virtue of my barns and this windfall which God gave me. And Jesus in the parable says, tonight you will surely die, and all of this wealth that you've stored up will go to another. In other words, the sin of the barn builder was a sin against the community. Again, back to Peugeot's Enoch video. You know, I've heard Peugeot talk about garments of skin. I talked about it so much, garments of skin, but I never really sort of got it until I watched the Enoch video. And then it's like, oh. Then when he mentions to James Lindsay his interpretation of Revelation, that you basically have the garden wrapped in technology, wrapped in the city, it's like, oh. It just really gave me a lot more clarity on Peugeot's perspective and worldview. Now, part of the difficulty is that when we say spirituality percolating up, that spirituality is such a fudgy word because there are many spirits and they want many things. You know, internet pornography is spirituality, sort of Gnostic spirituality. Bitcoin is spirituality. Love of your automobile is spirituality. It's just way too broad. We, in our culture, tend to think of spirituality as, well, it's a little distinct from religious, but it's, and in fact, it's sort of set opposed to religious as if you're tithing because you're a Christian, that's not spirituality. But if you're just sort of known as being generous to your community because you just think it's the right thing to do, well, then you're being spiritual. It's like, So I think what is offering new opportunities that we are seeing in this little corner of the internet is, again, because of the breakup of the winter of modernity. And so now I've got to get back on that email today and put it on the calendar. We're going to schedule a conversation between myself and Vervaeke and Jordan B. Cooper. And immediately when Jordan B. Cooper said, Luther is read as way more nominalist than he is, it's like, wow, that directly impacts Vervaeke's awakening from the meaning crisis narrative. So that'll be a fun conversation to listen to. And I'm sure both will have some really excellent points. So I'm really looking forward to that. That's fairly nerdy. But how can we have a post-Christian, post-Buddhist, neo-Platonist cognitive scientist from Toronto and in some ways, ultra reactionary Orthodox symbolist from Montreal and a Calvinist minister and just go, and Joey and Sam and Mark, and how are we doing this? This is so amazingly ecumenical. Why does a Calvinist minister cheer Protestants joining the Orthodox Church? That can't be right. I'm really surprised nobody's sort of taken a shot at me for that. Well, it's sort of because, we've kind of got a common enemy right now. I had a conversation with John Van Donk, and I won't name him, another pastor from the land down under, yesterday, and we talked about, I'm thinking more and more about Estuary Inc. and thinking about it might be important to start something that would do something analogous to what Pangburn did. So that's kind of at the high level, and then kind of an intermediate level, a little bit more programming to sort of connect Estuary with other local things. And I told a story about a Christian school that my parents helped start, that when I was in junior high, helped convert an old decaying mill, former silk locomotive mill in Patterson, into a Christian school. And then there were some internal conflicts in the group that launched the Christian school. And there was a fight, and there was not a literal divorce in a marriage, but a divorce between elements of the group, and one faction of the group got control of the school. And I said, even if, right now, Vervaeke and Peugeot and Vanderklay and Jordan B. Cooper and Jordan B. Peterson and James Lindsay and Benjamin Boyce and Brett Weinstein, to one degree or another, we can all sort of be one big happy family, but there'll come a day when, if in fact any of this actually accomplishes anything, or anything is accomplished through us, that there will be divisions and separations, and anything instantiated like an institution or an organization someone will get custody of it in the divorce. And I told John Van Donk, I'm totally okay with that. And I expect things like that to happen, because that's the kinds of things that do happen. So yeah, we have new opportunities for ecumenicity, and there will be a window of that. But the more these little efforts succeed, the more division there will be in the future, because that's sort of the nature of fallen humanity. But let's cheer the opportunities that we have while we have them, and make the most of them while we have them. That's my thinking. Paul, are egregores democratic, or do they represent the will of the people? Well, especially when you think about egregores in B.J. Campbell's imagination, they are sort of emergent spirits that develop agency that then goes on to colonize other people. I mean, how on earth can we not see the reality of that? In the past, we didn't use that language. We just talk about ideas. That was an idea. The time came for that idea, something that so they're democratic in that, especially if you look at B.J. Campbell's sort of, when he looks at Reddit, voting up and voting down, they're very democratic in that people afford them power as people embrace them and sort of vote them up the hierarchy. And if you get 1 million people voting them up the hierarchy and 1,000 people downvoting them, yeah, they're very democratic. But the key concept in that idea is that what happens is that the agency of the egregore itself is more powerful than the people down below. And the spirit is having its way with the people because the people are not at the right level to actually move the spirit. And again, just go back to my school spirit analogy. Now, in a school, let's take a high school someplace. And now some people have made the comments that, well, high schools are different in Europe and what have you. So 50% of my audience is American, so the other 50% is going to have to forgive me. Let's imagine the high school that you went to. And let's imagine that in this particular high school, a negative spirit has taken hold. And now that negative spirit could have taken hold because, let's say, there was a teacher who was abusing students, or, a whole range of things could happen. So a negative spirit took hold. Now, what's going to happen in the school is that the principal and the school board are going to want to change the spirit of the school. Now, the principal and key teachers, favorite teachers, have more spiritual power than a lot of the students. But some students have a lot of spiritual power. The captain of the football team might have some spiritual power. The class clown might have some spiritual power. The good-looking, charismatic girls and boys might have spiritual power. The student body president might have spiritual power. Now, if you can marshal all of those forces to address, let's say, a teacher who was molesting students, and really, you can turn actually something like that into a powerful win. Now, when you look at, let's say, the Roman Catholic pedophile priest scandals, part of the problem that the Catholic Church has had was that they should have marshaled the spiritual forces of the Pope, the cardinals, the hierarchy, lay leaders, all of those, and they should have figured out how to address this and turn it into a win. Now, there's a lot of people out there that say, oh, it's so obvious how to address this. You hand over the pedophiles to the cops. I agree. Hand them over to the cops. Let the state prosecute them. But all of those means they might, in fact, be very good ideas and something you should do. But in all likelihood, they're insufficient. And, well, what are you going to have? Well, maybe we'll have some liturgies of repentance. Well, that might help. But there's always going to be something, Mark always being in the Bridges of Meaning when I do my live streams. I mean, Mark is colonizing me. You're colonizing me, Mark. And you talk about this Gödel's, what is that? Incompleteness theorem about closed systems and open systems. I mean, all of these spiritual systems are open. because we're not standing in a position to sufficiently, we cannot employ the spirit of geometry on them, because we're down here. And so we have power with agreement with other people. But the real question is, do you actually achieve democratic spiritual power in any other way besides having a principality or power express itself in the people? In other words, in the question, there's sort of an idea that you can have an egregore clean room where we can isolate ourselves from the spirits. And I would argue that you can't. That the spirits were long before us, and the spirits are not within our grasp, just like a principal all by him or herself can't exercise the spiritual damage that a really bad teacher does to the school all by themselves. What you need to do is invite a much stronger spirit to come in and kick out the evil spirit. Someone asked about the exorcism word, the exercise word in the video on McWhorter. No, it's absolutely the right word. And that's why Peugeot likes to call Jordan Cyrus. I like to call him the unauthorized exorcist of Mark 9, because what he was doing to John McWhorter was exorcism. Now, was John McWhorter totally delivered from this sort of new atheist definition of religion? No. Most who have been exorcised by Jordan Peterson were subject to dozens, if not hundreds, of hours of video treatment. We all know that. So, democratic, most of the time when you see people en masse, it's because a spirit is moving them. And like my answer with agency before, the will of the people is itself spiritual. Again, in a modern frame, we think the will of the people is this thing that's independent of any agency above human beings. I think it's sort of like asking, it's sort of like trying to empty your flooded basement, but the end of the hose at the end of the pump is right next to the house, and so all the water is going back into the basement. The will of the people is a spirit. And that's the way we talk. Okay. What does Paul think of Peugeot's castrated father? Hesiodic history interpretation of modern political power from the Boyce Lindsay talk. This does not imply the necessity of theocratic politics. Is PVK on board with that? I'm going to have to listen to that more. I heard it briefly. I haven't thought about it enough. I want to think about that more. There is Lewis talks about this in The Abolition of Man. There is a castrated quality to modernity. And I think that's part of what leads us to a meaning crisis. But it's like I said earlier, Peugeot is talking in, so when he makes the point about rebellion, he has a good point. The sons of the rebels rebel against their fathers. And the sons who castrate their fathers will themselves be castrated by their sons. And there's a cycle that develops there. There's a very clear, long, enduring pattern in that. When Jonathan Peugeot, sort of as a vaccine conscientious objector, doesn't get vaccinated, is he castrating Justin Trudeau? When one of the things that's pretty clear in that talk is Canada has a much more tyrannical government right now than we have in the United States, partly because of our political process. The American government, the United States is the product of such a castration. The founding fathers castrated King George in a way. Canada is a son of King George. Which culture is more impotent right now? So, some initial thoughts. How does one know if and when God cares? Can we use the package of John Vervaeke's 4 Ps to find the answer? And how do I know if my pursuit of this answer is in alignment with his said care? Am I going insane? You are not going insane. That's the easier part of the question to answer. Classically, pastors would say the evidence of God caring is his brutalized son on the cross. And I'm working, my sermon is not anywhere near as far along as it needs to be for a Friday, I'm afraid, this week. So I don't know what the rough draft is going to look like. But this narrative in Christianity of the crucified king. So my text this week is in the Gospel of John with Pilate's sign in Aramaic, Greek, and Latin, Jesus, King of the Jews, on the cross. And the authorities, the Jewish authorities, object. It should say, he said he was King of the Jews. And Pilate, one of the most famous tautologies in human history, says, I have written what I have written. The Gospel of John is so multi-layered. There's all these little tricks in the Gospel of John that are just like this. Born again or born from above, living water, John 4. The whole story rests on all of these inversions. And in some ways you sort of get to the climax there where the Roman puppet declares Jesus king. Well, what exactly is, what kingship are we talking about? And how does that relate to, we have no other king but Caesar? It has much more to do with pattern in the way of kingship, which is analogous to the way of messiahship. So the answer to your question is very simple. Yes, God cares for you. Well, how can you know? You can see it with Jesus on the cross. Now, this gets complex very quickly. Well, that's his son. If that's the way he treats his son, what chance do I have? And I'd have to ask, what do you mean by cares? And, Chad, you and I have had this talk before. If God cares for you, why would he allow you to be an alcoholic? you yourself have noted, if it hadn't been for your alcohol, your issues with alcohol, you would not have found him in the same way or to the same degree. But now in this moment, you might say, yeah, but I'm not feeling it. And I can say, yeah, I understand that. Part of being us is sometimes not feeling it. I've got a wonderful conversation coming out on the channel soon with a woman from the Chicago estuary who told me the story of she had a kid who had real behavioral issues. A little kid had real behavioral issues, and someone told her, cut out wheat from the kid's diet. She cut out wheat and all the behavioral issues went away. She cut out wheat from her own diet, and she noticed that when she eats wheat, she has a short temper. And when she doesn't eat wheat, she doesn't have that problem. It's like, what's with that? Why does wheat have dominion over her life? Why does the amount of sunshine have dominion over your mood? Why do the vagaries of the economy have dominion over the ability to put food on your table and provide things that will please and satisfy your wife? Yeah, that is our lot. But it's a really funny thing to convince a human being that they're loved. There are some people that no matter how much good you do for them, will not believe they are loved. Things that contribute to that might be their upbringing, how their parents treated them. Try as you might, put a ring on their finger, put them in a palace, give them money, give them food, give them attention, give them vacations, give them anything that you can possibly give them. Say, now do you know that I love you? No. It's like they don't have love receptors. Are they loved? Oh, absolutely. What is the matrix by which I am deciding whether or not I know I'm loved? Well, if God loved me, then I would have the optimal number of children, I would have the optimal amount of money, and I would have the optimal quality of relationships in my life, and well, that doesn't square with, I know God loves me because he made me an alcoholic. So you're not going insane. Part of what's so hard about being a human being is we're blown by winds. Different spirits inhabit us. But the proof of God's love for you is his son brutalized and killed by us. It's a strange answer, I know. Eric Youngart. Hey, Paul, I've had a week to wrestle with your answer from the last question and answer and wanted to follow up. How can you expand more on what you mean by the goal isn't the church, the goal is Christ? Are we meant to take on Christ's identity before we start properly bring all these spirits back into the kingdom of God? We're commanded to receive Christ and his spirit. And as his spirit colonizes us, we will become more and more like him. Again, in that same conversation with that person who has the issue with wheat, she made the comment, and she's right, that one of the funniest things about Christian saints is that they're so different. How can we spot sainthood, do the relevance realization and find the essence of sainthood in all these different individuals that are so dramatically different? Well, that's how Christ fills up the hierarchy. If that's the prerequisite, then Jonathan Peugeot's recent video on the book of Enoch illuminates a much larger problem. He seems to paint the picture that all technology, practical, destructive, artistic, comes from the spirit of Cain interacting with these fallen spirits. We modern people are so wrapped up in skins that these spirits have provided that we can't imagine existence without it. If we're still struggling to integrate the mushroom spirits that have existed within us in probably millions of years, then how do we have any hope to integrate spirit like Tesla, YouTube, FromSoft, and Pfizer into the kingdom of God? These are just examples of spirits that have a big impact on your videos recently. You're basically asking, how can we save ourselves? And we can't. If you ask, how can God save us? Read the book of Jonah. Salvation is of the Lord. The book of Jonah, now maybe I shouldn't play favorites in terms of books of the Bible, but the book of Jonah is a remarkable book. Again, it's one of these books that demonstrates the absolute brilliance of the Hebrew scribes. A tiny little book. You know, how does Jonah know God loves him? Causes a storm at sea. And then Jonah, well, good. I'm done. I'm done with all of this mess that God has put me in. Tells the pagan sailors, throw me into the sea and the seas will calm. So they try everything because they're good men and they don't want to do it. But finally, they have no other choice. They throw Jonah into the sea, and Jonah's, on one hand, Jonah's like, okay, I've suicide by God. He goes all the way to the bottom, and there's a psalm at the bottom of the sea. And then a great fish comes and swallows him. God's like, oh, Jonah, I'm not letting you out of my narrative that easily. My answer about Jacob and wrestling. How can, here's what we want. We love Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit because there's adventure. We want meaning. We want adventure. We want self-efficacy. We want agency. We want all of this. We also want to know that in the end, good wins, that the story is U-shaped. We get both. But salvation is of the Lord, and his will be done. And God can't help but win. Reality is not finally a dualism. God is God and will have his way. Sorry, I'm going so quickly. I'm just, okay. End of questions. 8, no Q&A, April 15. Can I do all of these in 10 minutes? What do you think lies at the heart of the discomfort, apprehension some Christians feel when talking to non-Christians? Insecurity in their own faith. They don't trust God enough. Non-Christians are not a problem. What do you mean they're not a problem? God wins. Christians are apprehensive in talking to non-Christians because Christians don't believe that God can make them and do with them as God chooses. Oh, Calvinism. I think Christians feel insecure and afraid. And again, in that conversation, it wasn't recorded, my conversation with Van Donk and the other pastor, I said, one of the biggest problems with pastors is that we're cowards. We don't believe. We don't believe enough. Christian, I feel like you have answered something like this before, but is there a way for us to gift you physical items? I got my mug. I got my mug and my T-shirt from the Grim Grizz community, Lobster Monkeys, like an address or an Amazon wish list or something of that sort. God bless. Thanks, Paul. I don't know. There's an Amazon wish list for living stones, but it's hard to just kind of put that out there because Rick and I use that for getting stuff the church needs. You know, it's not really good to send things to the church anymore because our mailbox is little and the homeless guys sleep under the mailbox. And so the mailman doesn't know where to send things and the UPS guy doesn't know how to get to me. So if you want my home address, Christian, send me an email and I'll send you my home address on my email. Hi, Paul. Is there a hierarchy of spirits? Oh, absolutely. Are spirits who influence humans themselves influenced by higher spirits and so on? Absolutely. Do you have any thoughts on peak oil, peak coal? Are we close to technological or economic stagnation? I have no idea. If yes, what kind of consequences do you see that having? I have no idea. I have no idea. I can't even figure out the Sacramento housing market. I can't even figure out if I should buy a motorcycle and ride around beautiful Northern California with Rick. Rick seems to think there's a good answer to that. But Paul, can you talk a bit about mature Christians a la Ephesians 4? Is it really happening? Do churches really tend to do that? What can be done? Verses 13 to 16 for reference. 13, until we all attain the unity of faith and the knowledge of the Son of God, to mature manhood, to the measure of the status of the fullness of Christ, so that we may no longer be children tossed to and fro by waves and cares, but every wind of doctrine, by human cunning, by craftiness and deceitful schemes. Rather, speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ, from whom the whole body, joined and held together by every joint with which it is equipped, when every part is working properly, makes the body grow so that it builds itself up in love. When I was listening to the Peugeot Lindsay conversation, I was thinking about the dynamics between perennialism and the uniqueness of the now. I would say that you can find throughout history, it's probably way more than has been recorded, moments when the church has gotten, and when I say the church, I don't mean the whole church, I mean instantiated churches, have been closer and further from this Ephesians 4 vision. I like Tim Keller got from one of his seminary professors an idea that revival happens when all of the, I've got the book here. So Richard Foster, I tell this in that video with the, Richard Foster has this book, Streams of Living Water. It won some prize. Gold Medallion Book Award. Was that Christianity Today? Anyway, you have all these different the contemplative tradition, the holiness tradition, the charismatic tradition, the social justice tradition, the evangelical tradition, the incarnational tradition. And so he kind of nicely lays out 6 different traditions that sort of make up the church. And Tim Keller's seminary professor made the observation that Tim Keller passed on that says, when there's revival, it's like, you know, when you have these old equalizers that have all these slide switches, God sort of takes his hand and goes whoosh, and the whole church just surges. And you can find, and Doug Wilson got right his comment about revival. Revival is what happens when things aren't normal. And there are revivals in history in all these different places of the world. Some are big, like in Korea. Some are small, like in New York City in the 19th century. They had a little revival. And where God's Spirit just sort of comes through and God just takes over and the world changes and then it stops and people want to get it back again. It's sort of like the civil rights miracle. Oh, let's have Let's have activists and let's have it come again. No, it's the work of God. It's levels up from us. And so if you're in a church or a moment in a bigger scale when Ephesians 4 just starts happening, praise God. Most of the time we struggle. Paul, on the topic of going back to orthodoxy and Peugeot, in your opinion, the Enlightenment was inevitable, right? I think probably. But does that mean that Peugeot is wrong about looking at the world through patterns and all that? No, I don't think that means Peugeot. Peugeot is not right about everything. And I think Jonathan Peugeot will be the first person to admit that, because he knows he's not right about everything. None of us are right about everything. All of us are wrong about more things than we are right about. But we keep talking and comparing notes and checking to get righter than we are. So no, Peugeot is a genius with respect to patterns, and I'm learning tons about him. But the Enlightenment, I think, was in some ways inevitable. That doesn't mean it's good or bad. It's good and bad. And Peugeot nearly says the same thing in the Lindsay conversation. Peugeot is a YouTuber. Enlightenment bad. I'm gonna forswear the use of electricity, cars, or paints or scraping tools that I don't mine myself from my own little hands. No, he participates in this world just like we do. So, but, I think now at the recession of the winter of modernity, it's a good time to do some evaluation of the Enlightenment. We couldn't do a lot of it the way we're doing it now prior to now because of the winter and because of some of the tyranny of some of those spirits, and some of the spirits are losing their grip on us. So suppose there's an argument or critique that Orthodoxy can make against Protestant ideas. Oh, there are lots of them. And bunches of them are right. That's what I'm wrestling with all the time. That a lot of what Peugeot says challenges the tradition that I inherited. That's a blessing to me. Read the book of Proverbs. And what that does is hopefully help me to refine. Now, Paul's going to go Orthodox. Not today. But I certainly am learning a lot. And we're figuring it out. And to have a conversation partner like Jonathan Peugeot via these videos, teach me and show me blind spots and blind sides in my tradition. What a gift. There are blind sides in his tradition. And, Peugeot's an interesting guy when he mentions, Mennonites in that conversation with Lindsay. So in some respects, Anabaptists are the polar opposite of the Orthodox. But Peugeot worked for Mennonite Central Committee in Africa. And so he was with Mennonites, and he understands some of the beauty of the Mennonite tradition. So we're all mutts in this dog kennel. And we're working through all of the breeding lines and the traditions that we've inherited. Let's see. Should a new Christian group be formed out of the Protestants taking on many of these ideas? Protestant groups are taking on these ideas. I can't tell you how many. Well, I can tell you because there's not that many. But one of the real movements in the Christian Reformed Church has been, and this is before I found any of these people or before they arose, has been this sacramental, this neo-sacramentalism that's in the Christian Reformed Church. So my good buddy, Eric Dirksen, Christchurch Davis, I mean, that church looks pretty Anglican, but Dirksen is Dutch Reformed. And I mean, he said to me once, he said, boy, if the Roman Catholics and the Orthodox ever get together, he's basically saying, I might have to jump ship. Well, we're all working on this stuff. And again, we're at a time now, and it's like saying globalization, good or bad, both. In some ways, globalization is bringing about the kinds of visions that you have in Isaiah 60 of the wealth of kings being brought into Jerusalem. What do you mean Jerusalem? Grand Rapids, Michigan is Jerusalem for the Christian Reformed Church. God's moving right now. And he's using Peugeot, and he's using Peterson, and he's using Vervaeke, and he's using this little corner of the internet, and he's using all sorts of things. And we're richly blessed by each other. There's something in all of these streams with different Christians arguing. Yeah. We'll argue. Will there be a new little Protestant? Will there be a Protestant movement that comes out of this? Will there be a Roman Catholic? I mean, Orthodox and Roman Catholics and Protestants, their ecclesiology functions in very different ways. In Protestants, there'd be a whole new denomination, maybe, or a whole movement. So you look at, let's say, the Young, Restless, and Reformed, the Acts 29 network. Even what a denomination is in Protestantism is being deconstructed. And so the new denominations that are forming today, the Alliance of Reformed Churches out of the Reformed Church of America, the Acts 29 network, the Willow Creek Association, Protestants are now retooling denominationalism. Catholics work in a totally different way. And I frankly have zero idea how the Orthodox work, because I see these Antiochian Orthodox and Syrian Orthodox and Greek Orthodox and Russian Orthodox. I have no idea. And then all of these videos about the Bishop of Constantinople and cephalic, ecclesiology is really a complex business. But all of what, depending on how big this little corner gets, will we have an impact? Well, Jordan Peterson is having an impact. How long and big and lasting, I don't know. To what degree will this little corner, Vervaeke and Peugeot have sort of been, swept up in the backdraft of Jordan Peterson, and that's how these things work. You see this throughout history. And what's interesting about history is it's not always the people who were big at the time who wind up being the big name through history. As some people have said, Jordan Peterson might be forgotten and Jonathan Peugeot might be remembered, or John Vervaeke might be remembered, or Jordan B. Cooper might be remembered. Who knows? History is weird like that. But God is doing something, and it's very ecumenical, and it's even, we are having substantive conversations with people who are by no means in any way convinced that God exists or that Jesus was anything special beyond a human being. We're having the kinds of conversations we couldn't have 20 years ago. Oh, they had really cool ones 20 years ago too. They were a little different, but stuff is happening. And to be a part of it, I feel immensely privileged and blessed. So, good questions. Hi, Paul. Chad, you had to put one below, didn't you? Hi, Paul. Much like you, feel at the core to be Protestant, though listening to some of the people you've had on, and not to mention Peugeot, I'm becoming by the hour more sold on Christ's need for ritual practice to bring about re-enchantment in our flattened modernist landscape. I attend a Baptist church, and so reintroducing some of this stuff, regular communion, for example, comes slowly and awkwardly, but I get the sense that the ritualism can grow. I think so too. So in my congregation, we have communion once a month. All of the other church plants in my cluster have weekly communion. The reason we don't have weekly communion in my church is basically because we are the oldest of these cluster of churches. And so you can't change an older thing as easily or as quickly. And there's some other dynamics too for that reason. I'd be pleased as punch to have weekly communion here, but I don't believe that the church is mine to dictate. If I were planting a church, there's some aspects that would look different from Living Stones. But that's because I didn't plant this church. I received this church. And so we'll see where all this goes. How you doing on time, Rick? You okay? Yeah, okay. I'll try not to be too much longer. Keep it poor Rick here. I think Christians need to do what Sam Harris wants to do. That sounds crazy, I know. But I'm trying to think about how I can have events and groups that not exactly what Sam Harris wants, because what Sam Harris wants has been tried so many times and it'll never work because it lacks the infinity point. I like that word that James Lindsley used, got from Mike Naya. I really like it sounds like the Infinity Stones, the infinity point. And I'm not here to start a watered down church, because watered down is never good. Watered down tea, watered down coffee, watered down juice, watered down is always bad. So I'm not looking to water anything down, but I do, I've always wanted something where people can talk about these things and not lose status and have space to figure them out. And Living Stones Church, as it is right now, has to serve what it was meant to serve and built to serve. And so I'm not going to rob the people of Living Stones of their church. A lot of people did that during the seeker movement. They'd come into a church and basically the pastor would heavy-handedly take things over, and basically the church would completely have to change. But I think we do need, and we're doing it right now, we're doing it on the internet. And Jonathan Peugeot is right that people should go to church. Well, which church and how, and is the church meeting their needs, et cetera, et cetera. Those are hard questions. But I think, especially being a Protestant, I should find some ways that I can be more helpful than I am now. So, yeah, it's a good question. Grim Grizz, please tell me more about monkeys full of snakes. Grim Grizz, okay. I'm only going to answer questions down to the bar. So, I've appreciated your balancing of all this out with a healthy, we're not going to just go right back to the Middle Ages. And so I wonder, if you were going to start a church from the ground up, not necessarily CRC, having the 2020 hindsight of wisdom and experience, what would you think would be the ecclesiology of that church to look like? I don't know. I've got ideas. I look at what my friend Rod Hugan has done in the Village in Tucson, Arizona. And I love my friend Rod. He is full of wisdom and God's Spirit. He's not only a physical giant. When you see him, you'll see he's a physical giant. He's also a spiritual giant, and he's 10 years older than I am. And I don't know how much longer the Lord will share him with us. But he founded a really lovely little church in Tucson. Good things come in small packages. You know, in most cases, a good family is somewhere between, I'd say, 5 and 10 people. A couple of parents, 3 to 6 kids. That's a nice size for a family. So to have that Ephesians 4 church, it's usually kind of small, so you can know each other. Sometimes even under the Dunbar number. It's kind of hard to have a church under the Dunbar number just because of the economics of real estate and those kind of things today, which is why you sort of scale up with denominations, et cetera, et cetera. I think about this sometimes. I don't know that God is calling me to plant a church. Let's say if Living Stones we'd have a council meeting in 6 months and the council just says, we can't do this anymore. Let's close up shop. What would PVK do? Well, John Van Donk would love me to work in his church in Southern California. I know that. But I think about that a lot. And maybe I have to keep thinking and praying about it. I don't know. But I myself need to worship. And so if Living Stones were to close up, I would, the next Sunday I would be in my friend Eric's church. But I've never, Rick, I would not be riding motorcycle with you the next Sunday. Rick's like, we're going to be riding motorcycle, you and me. You don't have Living Stones anymore. No, I would. Would I plant a church? I don't know. If I were to plant it, see, I'm Hank Cruz. Some of you know Hank. He's in the Chicago estuary. Hank Cruz always says, well, you're like Bill Hybels. In some ways I am, because I would want to start a church for people who don't seem to fit into church. They have a hard time finding the churches that they fit into. But figuring out the Venn diagrams of that, and I now do feel a sense of responsibility to a broader audience, thanks to all of you in this channel. And so figuring that out and what that should look like locally and. But I trust God. He will lead me. And, he might lead me through some catastrophes, but he will lead me because I am not my own. Read the first question, answer the Heidelberg Catechism. All right. Regarding what you mentioned about people that do not allow themselves to be loved, my dad is like that. C.S. Lewis says that the door to hell is locked from the inside. What a powerful turn of phrase. That is so true. I would say this. All you can do is what you can do, which is act with love towards them, be trustworthy. Love is a verb. Love them, whether or not they can feel it. And then I would say pray. It's funny that now that there's been a renewal of imagination and even belief in the agencies and beings levels up from us, then suddenly we have the panic of, well, what if we can't track them? What if they're having their way with us? Oh, they're having their way with us. That much is obvious. Just look around you. What can we do? Well, the Christian church, and not just the Christian church, many other religious traditions have all had the same answer to that. It's pray. Pastor, prayer, sit and mumble words in my bedroom all by myself. Listen to Sam Harris talk to Jordan Peterson in Vancouver 1. Jordan Peterson says, I can imagine how prayer changes things. The answer is pray. Now you might think, well, yeah, but I prayed for things and they didn't happen. Well, that principal did what he could to rescue the spirit of his school, and he might not have succeeded. And he found that all of his efforts didn't necessarily yield what he wanted as directly as pouring coffee in water leads to coffee. Yeah, that's because the world is big and we are weak, and there are spirits that are far larger than we are. But that's why we pray. So, do you want to be spiritually powerful? Pray. Vapor Trails, $10. I don't have the, let me see if I can see the comment. Oops.
Hey, Chad, I just posted it, Paul, I just posted it at the bottom of the questions.
Oh, okay. I've never heard you speak more than in passing about John MacArthur, rather famous fellow Christian California Calvinist. How would you compare yourself to him in terms of theology and approach? MacArthur is a cessationist. I am not. I think John MacArthur is, even though he's conservative in terms of his politics, I think he is highly modern. And I am much more of a traditionalist than MacArthur is. I haven't listened to much MacArthur. I haven't read any of his books. I've gotten wisps of, I think he sort of tries to merge some dispensationalism and Calvinism, which to me makes no sense. He's obviously successful. I want to do some, again, this conversation I had with this person from the Chicago estuary. I'm going to cut that up and release little bits of that video before I release the whole conversation again. I did that with BJ Campbell's, and I do that when I have a conversation. It was a 2-hour conversation, but there are some segments in there that deserve standalone treatment. And one of those was talking about Benedict option type communities in our current context and some of the spirits of fear that grab them and some of the ways that those spirits of fear distort them. Whereas, I have a world of appreciation for Rod Dreher. I have a lot of respect for his Benedict option idea, and I think it's right in many respects. Many of the actual little communities, I talked about this also on More Christ. I did a conversation with Mark and with Andrew Root again. I don't know when Mark is going to put that out, but at some point after it's been on his channel a little while, I'll ask him if I can post it on my channel. He'll probably say yes. But I talked about some of the dynamics of those types of communities. And so, yeah, I don't talk about MacArthur much. I don't pay much attention to it. It's not, see, and this is where identifying as a Calvinist sort of hurts me, because when people hear I'm a Calvinist, they think about John MacArthur, they think about John Piper, they think about Doug Wilson. The Reformed world is actually really broad. And there are lots of different kinds of Calvinists. And there are many different kinds of Protestants that are Calvinistic, that don't wear the label. John Calvin seriously impacted the shape of Protestantism, especially Protestantism in America. When I was listening to James Lindsay, boy, you can tell he's been hanging out with certain kinds of Calvinists. Calvinism has impacted a ton. And there are tremendously progressive and liberal Calvinists. Look at the RCA churches, the collegiate churches in New York City, very woke, Reformed churches. And then you look at, and you say, John MacArthur is Reformed and Marble Collegiate is Reformed. Now, Marble Collegiate and John MacArthur, no, don't put those two together. There'll be bloodshed. So Reformed is a very big label. And most of the attention has come with the Young, Restless, and Reformed movement, which is one of the branches of the emergent movement, also connected with Mark Driscoll. So my Dutch Calvinism is part of that family, but sort of a moderate group, and that's sort of where the CRC is. So, no, John MacArthur, if you asked him about the CRC, he would probably not have a lot good to say. So, okay, I don't take offense, but John MacArthur is a very big deal in California, especially Southern California, but he's got churches in other places. And his influence is impacting some Christian Reformed churches. But there is some in the Christian Reformed Church, there's some tension over some of that too, because his brand of Calvinism doesn't really play well with some other brands. So, all right, that's it for today. Thank you all for joining us. I hope this was helpful. And again, no question and answer next week, Friday. It's Good Friday. Go to church. And I'll see you probably then in 2 weeks, if not in a live stream on the Bridges of Meaning or just my regular videos, or if you show up here at Living Stones. So thanks for watching. Okay, Rick.